Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Episode 100. I did not think this was going to happen. Time flew. And listen, we're not going to slow down. Not even a little bit. In fact, we wanted to do something special. So here is your first episode this week because we're putting out two this week. First one, Michael Finkel in his book, The Art Thief. It is about probably the most prolific art thief ever in history. And also, you, I'm pretty sure, have not heard his name because I didn't until I read this book. I thought the book was perfect for a 100th episode. Michael is perfect for a 100th episode because he's passionate about this book and he has his own interesting story that we kind of dive into. Had a little bit of controversy early in his career. Completely open about talking about it and how that's changed the way he goes about his work. Really interesting episode. I think you're going to love it. And keep an eye out because later this week, we're putting out another episode that I think you'll love as well. Before we get to Michael, just a reminder, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, please listen, leave comments, follow all of those wonderful things. I'm going to shut up. Let's get to Michael. And here we are with author Michael Finkel, The Art Thief, a true story of love, crime, and a dangerous obsession. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, I really, really want to dive into The Art Thief because it's a crazy story. Like, it's just straight up crazy. But always like to do a little background, and you have, let's say, a very interesting background. If anybody goes on Wikipedia, they're going to see it, so we'll kind of go through it. You were at the New York Times. You left under non-ideal circumstances because of a mistake that you made, which to me, like, that's all done. They can read your book, True Story, to really kind of understand all of that stuff, how you felt about it and everything like that. What's interesting to me is what happened there. That's happened to other people. They've done things like that. And we've never heard from them again. And now you're on basically your third critically acclaimed book. What do you think is the difference between somebody who makes a mistake and just disappears and you who is able to stick around? Are you just like a really talented wide receiver in a football game that you think you're that talented you can get away with whatever you want, or do you think it's something else?
Oh, I'd like to be known as a talented wide receiver. I don't think anyone's ever used that. All 5'9", 170 pounds of me, but I'll take that for sure. I mean, listen, I'm 100% human. There is filled with flaws, make mistakes, probably make 3 before breakfast every morning. Yeah. Well, so what happened with the New York Times is that no need to beat around the bushes. This was more than 20 years ago. In 2000, I combined a bunch of interviews together to make what's known as a composite character, which is against the rules of journalism. Got caught for that and got fired from the New York Times Magazine. Hadn't done that before. Will never do that again. You know, I fully admit that as a journalist, as a writer, as a person, I love people that push boundaries. I like creative outlets. And, in journalism, of course, you have to stay between the boundaries of truth. And I always look for the craziest true stories and stay between those boundaries. But what happened with the New York Times was basically experimented way too much and fell into the area of fiction. And I remain a little bit embarrassed about that. But it did happen more than 20 years ago and have been able to bounce back. You asked why. I really think, Brendan, if there was any reason, it's that I have no other skills except for being a journalist. And so I didn't really have anything else to fall back to, because I think, someone could say, to you, oh, what do you do for a living? I was like, yeah, I run around and ask other people what they do for a living is pretty much what I do. And so, in other words, I don't really have any skills except for talking. And so I guess after I lost my job, I thought, man, this might be the end. I'm really passionate about finding stories and reporting on them. And so one of the things that I love about the world is every once in a while you get a second chance. And I feel that on some weird way, like we'll talk about The Art Thief. And you mentioned earlier how the story is so twisty and turny and unbelievable, but I'm more cautious than ever before. I want to tell all your listeners that everything we talk about tonight in terms of the story and the books is not 99% true, not based on a true story, but completely true. I now hire 2 independent fact checkers to check my work. I feel like, yeah, you mess up once, you get a second chance, but then there's no other, you have to be the cleanest possible journalist. And I kind of feel that the last 20 years have proven that I can write not just ridiculously unbelievable stories, but ones that are completely trustworthy.
That's what I appreciate about your story, right? Is that I think the reason why you're here where a lot of other people under the same circumstances disappeared is you admit that you screwed up. It's not oh, well, this happened and this guy should have done this. And technically it was just kind of, this shouldn't have been done. I did it. And, especially with your books, you also make it quite clear, as you just said, I'm double checking everything. You're going to be under the microscope, that people are going to have those questions. But even for us, you were fully willing to talk about this right off the bat, even though it's something from 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's not my very favorite topic, of course, but shoot, I grew up in the internet age. There's no secrets anymore. So you got two choices, which is like pretend something didn't happen. Well, everybody knows, or just face it. It's not, again, not my favorite thing, but I've raised 3 children. I know the value of, 100% of us are going to make mistakes frequently. I don't think that's a question in life. Are you going to make mistakes? I think what really tests you as a person, as a parent, even as a kid, is like how you handle your mess ups. And I think it takes some fortitude, as I tell my kids, to look someone in the eye and say, man, I made a mistake. I apologize. And not just apologize. I'm going to prove to you that I'm going to make up for this with, behavior. Actions speak louder than words. Apologies are painful, but easy. But, doing 23 years of clean, heavily fact-checked journalism should speak volumes to you. I think that in a weird way, I think that anyone who reads my book should be less worried that there's any sort of shenanigans going on than anyone else, because I am on the thinnest of ice. For the rest of my life, I'm the one who has to be like this. There's no third chances, really.
Now, I didn't want to just dig up old stuff. It's kind of a perfect mixture and, opposite of, let's talk about our boy, Stéphane, the art thief of the book. He himself probably is not quite dealing with his own mistakes. Where did you even hear this story? I know when I started reading this, I'm like, I'd never heard this guy's name before. How did you come across this story?
Yeah, and I was even going to have another segue, which is the fact that I do not ever present myself as a flawless human being. And I do tend to write about scallywags and criminals and people that have broken the law. And by just like we started this interview off the bat by saying, basically, Mike, you are an imperfect and flawed person. I'm like, yes, sir. Sometimes journalists have this weird tendency to present themselves as this like model of perfect behavior and almost like this sort of cocky, sort of holier than thou attitude. I never present myself that way. I'm usually like, hey, man, I know about making mistakes. I know about getting pummeled. And sometimes people respond to that quite well. So you mentioned the art thief, which we'll get into. So I happen to speak French with a terrible accent. I did learn about this story. So just briefly, as your listeners, I'm sure will learn, this is pretty much the most prolific art thief that has ever lived. And we're not talking about ancient history here. We're talking about the 1990s and the 2000s. This Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief, is now 50 years old, basically, and living alive and well. And I was able to interview him in person. So I read a small newspaper article in a French publication, and every single line, like most prolific art thief of all time, $2 billion worth of art. We'll get into this. Stole it for the love of art. Like every single line was like, oh my gosh, I have more questions and more questions. And so just, one of the things I love to do is pretend that I'm like the news director of the world and like go on to small town newspapers around the world in French and English, or I'll even translate from German or Spanish and sort of just spend a morning when I'm looking for article ideas, sort of scouring what would be like in the 1980s, like a newsstand of the world filled with like newspapers from all around the world. Instead, I just do that on the web and sort of try to find the stories that fit in that crack between it's not quite covered by the daily newspapers, but yet is absolutely riveting and fascinating and has lots of twists and turns. Anyway, so yes, a little article sparked my curiosity. And then I like to get in touch with people by writing a handwritten letter, which is very old fashioned, but there's something even to this day. We talked about how modern everything is, about putting pen to paper, stamp, envelope, mail. And when you receive a handwritten letter these days, it usually stands out like, who sends you a handwritten letter? It's like, it's usually like a condolence letter or like, something like that. But, just a personal letter saying, hey, I'm Mike. I'm interested in talking to you. Here's what I've written. And that's usually the way I make my first introductions.
Now, 2 technical questions before we get into the absolute bonker story. First things first, as we just talked about, right, you've got to fact check everything. Are you a bit nervous? Like you're going in and we're going to talk about this. Stéphane's not exactly somebody that you can trust exactly what he says. There's so much, like you're going into this saying, I'm about to talk to somebody who's going to intentionally try to mislead me. Is that intimidating, or do you just fall back on, I'm just going to have to fact check everything, take it all in, and just go through the process?
I think that's an interesting question. Without getting too long-winded, we can unpack it a little bit. I mean, like everybody who talks to a journalist on some level is trying to portray themselves in a certain light. And usually it's a kinder light than reality. So, I think I've been a journalist for more than 35 years, and I sort of am aware of like what's going on in a way. Like everybody like wants them to be heroic, the hero of their own story. So yes, I first of all record or video every single thing, and especially if I'm speaking in French, so I can carefully translate or have professional translators translate it. But also I love to, a couple of quick tricks. I love to, of course, when it comes to a criminal, I'll get the police reports. I'll talk to the investigators. I'll talk to the victims, ask them their side of the story. If there's any contradictions, I'll come back to the criminal. This is why when I write a book, I need to talk to the main characters. I can't reconstruct things from just historical documents or even court reports. Other people can. I like to talk to the criminal, him or herself. And, I guess the second thing is that sometimes the way someone lies to you tells you a lot more truth. And in a funny sort of way, there are some criminals, two I can think of at least, that are or several of them that are extremely precise about the truth, even though they're sort of lying about the big pictures. They're very careful about every specific move. And so I have to figure out what category everyone is. Breitweiser was so careful about being precise about literally every step he took in a museum, had to be precise. And, I didn't steal that piece and I unscrewed that screw and I, fooled that guard. And so almost everything that Breitweiser said about his crimes, which we'll get into, seemed to check out. It was like his global motivation that he was lying about, like he was rescuing works of art from the terrible prison of museums. It was sort of his rationale that was completely skewed. I usually like to let criminals present their own point of view and let the reader realize that they're sort of lost in their own world of egotism. And usually the truth will out. But anyway, I spend lots of time working on these books, years/decade plus. Again, try and look at all sources. And then when I get to I think there's even a note in this book, hey, some of these things are just from Breitweiser himself. Take it with a grain of salt. I'll sometimes instruct the readers. Readers are sort of to me like a jury. The way I like to read a book is I don't like it when the author tells you what to believe. I like it when an author sort of presents all the evidence in the most compelling way possible and lets the reader sort of decide, this guy is guilty of sin, or this guy is sort of like, he deserves to be let go, or this guy deserves to be put in jail for life. Any of those reactions are fine. The more varied the reaction, the better I feel like I presented a twisty story.
Speaking of the presentation, this is the second technical question. You write in the present tense, which I found very interesting, right? Especially when you're writing about something that happened, it's past tense. But for this book, you have it in the present tense. Now, I know for me, at first it's kind of like, he's writing in the present tense. Like it doesn't click for a few pages. Then it actually feels a bit more urgent. It adds urgency to all of these actions. Did you have a specific thought process about that? Is that just how you wrote it? What were you thinking?
I think one of the secrets, and I don't know how many other writers talk to you about this, but I'm not 100% sure what I'm doing when I'm writing something. And actually, anybody out there who's listening or is a writer and thinks like a writer is absolutely self-confident and sure of what he or she is doing, you're just fooling yourself. Like I'm sitting there when, and writing, of course, is a solo sport. You have editors. Yes, I get edited, I get feedback, but most of the time I'm just by myself trying to figure out how to tell a story both truthfully and compellingly. And when it comes to tense, like present tense, I will just look you right in the eye and say, I am not sure if that was the best decision, but so many things are feel things. And just as you said, there's like, as well, I'm sure we'll discuss, there are a lot of twists and turns and crazy coincidences and unexpected moments in the story of the art thief. And I just was sitting there in my closet that I write in. I have this little sort of deprivation booth in which I put all my research behind me. We'll go to a baseball stadium and they have some of those seats painted black. They call it the batter's eye so you can see the ball. Like when I'm sitting at my desk, I like a white wall in front of me. I don't want any distraction. Everything has to be behind me, and I'll light just one candle. And as soon as I spark that candle, this is just between me and you and your listeners, I lit the candle. No more surfing the internet, no more answering emails, no more, picking lint out of my belly button. It is time to get to work. And then I'm just like, all right, let's try it in the present tense. Let's try it in the past tense. Let's try it in the third person, the first person, the second person. And it's really, in the end, what I think works the best. And I'm only trying to present the story in a way that I think the reader will enjoy the most. I think there are other writers that don't think about readers, but I'm not one of them. I think about people reading my book all the time. And so this is a long way of saying, if you read the book and think that the present tense didn't work, I'm not even going to argue with you. I'm going to be like, yeah, I thought that too. But at times, but I really think that if I written in the past tense and handed it to you, you'd be like, you know what? No, it was better in the present tense. So really, I'm just admitting to you that a lot of these things are like that guy at the soundboard in a concert with all those little dials. And I'm spinning all those little dials in the way that I think is the most compelling, short, exciting, intellectually stimulating, weird, fun, all those adjectives. But another writer would spin the dials another way. And that's one of the wonderful and frustrating things about the craft, which is that there's no right or wrong way to do it.
We've never done this before. I'm going to do a quick lightning round because I told 3 or 4 people about the book, and I'm like, you're not going to believe this, right? And they basically asked the same few questions. So real quick.
Yeah.
Number 1, how much worth of art did he steal?
So museum art is hard to price, but professional art journalists have said that Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief, stole 200 times. He stole about $2 billion, that's a B with a billion dollars worth of art just to hang in his bedroom and admire. $2 billion worth of art.
Next question, they all asked this. How much money did he make off selling the art?
Let's just say until we're going to keep some of the twists and turns of the end. This is like a classic. This book is like a classic Icarus story. The higher you fly to the sun, the harder you're going to crash. I don't think anybody in maybe the history of art crime took more chances and flew higher than Stéphane Breitweiser. So there's a crash in the end, but before everything comes crashing down in Stéphane Breitweiser's life, the total amount of money that he made over stealing $2 billion worth of art is exactly 0.
How many people did he hurt stealing the art? Physically, I should say this, physically.
I mean, even mentally. Breitweiser stole during the day, sometimes with guards or people in the room, never brandished a weapon, never so much as threatened violence. So the number of people he hurt is like the amount of money he made. That would be 0. He prided himself on that. In fact, Breitweiser told me in one of our interviews that he didn't like being called an art thief. And when I asked him why, he's like, name an art thief. And I said, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And he's like, yeah. Let's talk about those guys. They broke in at night. They attacked the night guards. They bound their face with duct tape. They handcuffed them to pipes in a basement. Very violent crimes. Breitweiser never was violent and only, quote unquote, broke into museums during the day by buying a ticket in cash and walking in the front door. But what those Gardner Museum thieves did next was even worse than attacking the guards, which is they went up to a Rembrandt seascape, one of the most amazing pieces of art in this entire museum, stuck a knife in the canvas and cut it out of its frame. That to Breitweiser is the act of a barbarian. Breitweiser, who, by the way, not only worked as a museum guard right out of high school, but also worked in a frame shop, knew how to remove frames from the back of pictures without harming them, and would take the canvas or the piece of wood it was painted on. He was so precise about taking care of these items. He thought that he shouldn't be called an art thief because he collected these works. He didn't do it for money. He did it for love. He didn't want to damage anything. He wanted to protect it. He wanted to be called a collector with an unorthodox acquisition style.
We can't fail to mention his very, very helpful girlfriend, and Catherine Kleinklaus. And here's the question. As you are going through and you're learning this story, what was more shocking to you? The frequency of their thefts or and I'm going to say it, really simplistic but effective methods that they used?
Yeah, so Stéphane Breitweiser and Catherine Kleinklaus, his girlfriend, starting in 1994 and through the mid-2005 or so, averaged for about almost a decade, averaged 1 art theft every 12 days, which is almost beyond imagining. Like, many criminals spend almost an entire career planning 1 art heist, and these guys sort of did it, a couple of times a month, if not more. So one of the things I do like about the story is that, there's theft after theft after theft. And as you mentioned, in like sort of, you could call it simple style, but instead of like overwhelming someone with a Uzi or a weapon, he sort of used intellectual jujitsu or outsmarted people, by misdirection and and some skill too, being able to read where the boundaries of security cameras, the attention span of security guards, the ability to get into cases, not necessarily pick locks, but like cut seals on display cases, as I mentioned before, remove frames from paintings. All these minor non-violent skills sort of added up to this like super thief. And I do like the fact that instead of the story really, theft after theft after theft can be a little cold and repetitive. What really the story is about is like a love affair, not only between Stéphane Breitweiser, the art thief, and the work she stole, but this raging and kind of incredibly complex love affair between Stéphane Breitweiser and his accomplice, his girlfriend, Anne-Catherine Kleinklaus. They lived in a room. Boy, I mean, your listeners have got to imagine this. They lived in a room in a tiny, like nondescript house in the suburbs of a French, like kind of industrial city, not a pretty tourist city, and stuffed an attic room with low ceilings and this little like narrow staircase to get to it. They stuffed this room with literally $2 billion worth of art. They hung on the walls. They put it on display on their, nightstands. They stuck things under the bed and in the closet. And they basically lived inside of a treasure chest, as I wrote. And there was a sexual component too. There was a very erotic thrill for Breitweiser stealing a work of art that he loved. And so they had this beautiful 4-poster bed in the middle and surrounded themselves with riches. And this relatively nondescript, nonviolent, non-professional thieving couple, set up this fantasy world that goes beyond almost anything imaginable. They lived in Alibaba's cave and slept there in a 4-poster bed.
Well, don't forget that his mom was downstairs.
Oh, the mother. I like the way you bring this up. So yes, it actually becomes a little bit of I'm not going to say a threesome, but there's also a third party candidate here, which is, Breitweiser lived with his girlfriend. Why did he live in the attic of his mother's house? He called himself a full-time art collector, with an unorthodox acquisition style. But really, if you're stealing once every 12 days, you're basically a full-time art thief. And so, which is a nicer way of saying you're an unemployed freeloader. Breitweiser did nothing but steal art, but he lived with his mother because he couldn't afford even paying rent. He was so broke. Here's a man with $2 billion worth of art that's so broke that he avoided highway tolls on his getaway drives. Like he had no money, but considered himself the richest man in the world. And if you're scratching your head at the contradictions of it all, that's exactly what you should be doing. It's like one of these stories, again, 100% true, that is so much of an outlier that it's just, you should buckle up when you read this and just see where all the twists and turns take you. So Breitweiser's poor mother, a pediatric nurse, letting her only child, her son, her unemployed freeloader son, live in his attic with his girlfriend. He's carrying all these valuable looking things up to the attic and telling mom, no, don't worry. I'm just getting them at flea markets, or these are just knockoffs. I'm just trying to make the attic room look prettier.
When you talk to him, does he have that kind of magnetism, that charisma? Like, do you sit there and talk to him and you're like, if I didn't know that he was full of it, right? Like, is this a guy that you'd meet in a bar and you'd be like, this is one of the nicest guys ever. I love talking to this guy. Or is he a little bit off?
The art thief's name is Stéphane Breitweiser, a Frenchman, born in 1971. We spoke to each other in French. I spent 11 years on this project and not only interviewed Breitweiser himself personally. I'm the first American journalist he's ever spoken to. He doesn't really like speaking to journalists very much, but perhaps mon accent français était un peu charmant. My French accent was a little bit charming to him. And he really liked American movies, thinks American people are just more open and maybe a little nuttier and maybe more understanding of kooky criminals than the buttoned up French. Anyway, Breitweiser himself, when I talked to him, he sort of had, I don't know if Jekyll and Hyde is exactly the right thing, but when I would talk to him, we did many of our interviews in these tiny little European hotel rooms. He's somewhat well known in his area of France and wanted to be by him. When we did interviews, wanted to speak quietly. And when I interviewed him, he was a little like laconic and monotone and would talk to me sort of like this in French, but without like great amounts of energy and what you might expect from a crazy thief. And then after our relationship progressed a little bit, I was like, let's go into museums, Stéphane. from which you stole. And I want you to just show me how you did this, because some of your thefts are so hard to believe that I just need to, despite reading the police reports and even seeing some like surveillance video when the police are after him, like I just wanted to see it. And so we took these long drives together, and even in the car, he would be mellow and laconic. And I'm sort of trying to combine in my head the person I'm talking to next to me, which by the way, I'm like, I can't believe I'm going to a museum with like the world's greatest art thief. Just talk about a head twister right there, or like a reason to love journalism at the same time. Like, hey, I'm not just going to an art museum in Europe. I'm going with an art thief. I freaking love my profession. Talk about crazy situations for me, let alone him. He's like quiet. And then we walk into a museum, and I note, like I said, Jekyll and Hyde's thing. Like I note this, like as if he'd just taken like a triple latte or something, like 3 shots of espresso or something like that. Like all his senses seem to come alive. Like he's noting where every guard is sitting or standing. He's like, look at that camera, look at that camera. And then he was like, even checking, like in small museums that we went to, he'd be like, look, that's a fake camera, man. Doesn't even have a wire. Like some of these things are props. He's noting where every work of art is. Like when I re-interviewed him, he wouldn't talk about just about the works he stole. He could sometimes name all the works that were hanging up on the wall of the gallery from which he stole. And I would go back and I'd be like, oh my God, he had like this crazy memory, but it was like someone just plugged this guy in after he had been analog. He's suddenly electric. This observational technique, this sort of like tactile. I'm holding my fingers out right now as I'm talking. I know I'm over the radio, but like just like the tips of his fingertips were like very sensitive. And then he would see. So this is just walking through a museum, and then he would see a work of art that he loved. Just like all of us, we don't fall in love with all work. Some people like, Da Vinci's, and some people like Picasso's, and some people like Georgia O'Keeffe's, and some people like photography. It's like we all love different things. But he would come across a work that struck him. He called it a coup de coeur, a hit, a blow to the heart. When he saw work that captured him, it was like a tractor beam. And from Star Trek, he would be like hyper focused on this work. And I could just watch him being like enveloped by its aura. And then after a few minutes of just me watching him watching this work, which is more interesting than you might think, he would start telling me what he loved about it. And I have to tell you, man, if Stéphane Breitweiser didn't become an art thief, he should have become an art professor, because if any of you have taken an art class, sometimes they get into this intellectual stuff that is so opposite of aesthetic beauty. Like if you see a person that you fall in love with, a woman, a man, anything like that, you fall in love with, the first, you're not going to start detailing all these things. You're just like, you're just kind of overwhelmed by the overall beauty of something. You don't be like, look at the color pattern, look at look at all the symbolism. You're like, just absorb this color. Look at this, just take a look at the whole thing and just like feel it. And I really love that Breitweiser was very open about his emotions. And then after all of that, then he would get down to the business, like, look at that camera. Look, we need 2 screws here. The only tool Breitweiser would ever use is a Swiss Army knife. And then he would start telling me the tour would lead from the front of the painting. Then we would look at how it was attached to the wall. Then we'd look at how many places we could take an exit, and how we would escape to his car, and how we would drive home to his house to put it in his attic. And so all of this happened when I was hanging out with Breitweiser. And I think as we started out this wonderful interview by saying, like, journalism is sort of like a fun and beautiful career if you're able to make it work. But basically all you have to do is sit next to some of the most fascinating people in the world. Crazy? Yeah. Criminal? Sure. Fascinating? Undeniable.
Did you frisk him before you got back in the car? Because if you didn't, Mike, I'm telling you right now, you're out of your mind. You probably had to frisk him every time.
So, Brendan, one of the museums we went into a few in Belgium. We went to a few in France. We went to 1 or 2 in Germany. We went to museums from which he stole and which he's banned from like returning to. He would put on these fake pair of eyeglasses and he put just a baseball cap low over his head and be able to get in. But the whole time, I'm not only like into following this art thief around, but there's like this little like voice in the back of my head saying, what am I gonna do if the person I'm writing about, the subject of my book, steals something in front of me? Am I going to have to call the police on my own subject of my own book? And I'm like having this moral dilemma. And I'm happy to say that I did not have to cross that line and decide what I was going to do. However, as it does mention in the book, one of the places we went to where he stole one of his very favorite things, a ivory sculpture of Adam and Eve. Ivory should be attached to elephants, but holy moly, it is a beautiful people have been entranced with ivory for forever. It makes amazing glow. And Breitweiser, the art thief, was one of his favorite mediums. He loved oil painting. He loved silver. He loved gold. He loved ivory. And one of the pieces that he stole, he recreated step by step every move he took, every screw he had to unscrew, every guard he had to avoid. And then going through the gift shop on the way out, I was like, the ivory's still back there. He didn't re-steal it. He stole this catalog that had a beautiful picture of the ivory, and I watched him do it, and I let him walk out the door. And I'm like, it's just a book. And later on, I'm interviewing one of his lawyers. He's like, you were with him when he stole a book? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, you could be charged as an accomplice to a crime. So I'm admitting to you here on the air that I maybe could be an accomplice to my, even just stealing a book. I sort of allowed him to get away with that much, and that's all I'm admitting to.
Well, I'll ask this question very carefully then. So as far as he didn't steal any actual art with you. That's all.
I'm pretty sure that he didn't steal any art in front of me, so we can get into his methods a little later. But one of his amazing abilities, Breitweiser's amazing ability, was to steal a work of art while other people were around. This was one of his signature moves that he would often wear. He liked to steal when it was coolish weather. He would wear a large overcoat, and he would be able to stick it in the waistband of his, often a painting that was maybe size of a pizza box or smaller, like size of a framed photo maybe, or even this sculpture, this ivory Adam and Eve, which seems really large. He would stick it in the waistband of his pants. He would pull his jacket over, and though there might be a lump there, people don't notice things like that. If you walk with confidence and don't, I would grab something and I would just start running out of the museum, and that's probably the most guilty behavior you could possibly do. Breitweiser was so smart about being a criminal that one of his keys was to subvert all expectations. And I'll say a line that he said to me, and then I'll explain. He said, something that a thief should never do is precisely what a thief should consider doing. For example, if you steal a work of art, like I said, what's the first thing you want to do for those of us that fantasize about these kind of things is get the hell out of the museum, right? That's what every art thief wants to do. Get the hell out of the museum as fast as possible. More than once, Breitweiser and Anne-Catherine, who served as his lookout and accomplice, they would steal something and they would do what an art thief would never do. They went to the museum cafe with the stolen work on their property. And these, often there's a big blank spot on the wall. The police are getting called in any second now. Go to the museum cafe, get lunch, sit down, and casually start eating. Now, let's just think about that. Is that completely crazy? Or when the police come rushing in the door, who are the last people the police are going to suspect? It's the cute couples sitting in the cafe, casually eating lunch. Those are not suspects. And think about that. That's exactly where they would be sometimes. They would be searching other people, and you could just walk right out the door. It takes sang-froid, cold-bloodedness, to a degree that I would just be flop sweating and be like, but they were able to. This is just one of many examples. They stole on guided tours, a guided tour where a museum official employee knows your face. That goes against anything that a criminal should do. Don't show your face to the museum employees and then steal something. But those are the last people that'll be suspected. The docent could be like, yeah, they were on a guided tour with me. I was with them the whole time. And so they were able to subvert expectations, Stéphane Breitweiser and Anne-Catherine Kleinklaus, for more than 200 crimes, 300 works, $2 billion before everything starts crashing down.
My favorite one, and this is just kind of perfect common sense, I believe it was the crossbow. They grab a crossbow. He wants this crossbow. You don't realize it until you're holding one. They're gigantic. And they just realize, hey, if we just drop it out the window onto some bushes, we'll just go around outside and just take it in an hour or so. And they did that. That's just what they did. It's like, oh, we'll just drop it out the window and go get it later. And it's unbelievable, but it's also kind of like, well, yeah, it'll be gone. And there's lots of stuff in a museum. And as you said, it was that coolness, that calmness that really separated himself, because they were expecting people to be running and they would just walk around like, oh, everything is fine. I didn't just steal something right off the wall.
One of the things that I love about this story, and whether people think it's a good book or not, you'll have to decide whether the writing is for you. But I really think that the story itself, how could you not be entranced by the wackadoodleness of the story? It's like, at first I'm like, when my thoughts about art crime are, all Tom Cruisey, smoke bombs and, infrared lights, and I'm coming smashing through the skylight on my rappel thing from my helicopter. That does sound cinematic and cool. But as Breitweiser told me again and again, in all 5 I was able to, I built up such trust with him that I got signed written permission to see his psychology reports. And all 5 of the psychologists, male, female, German, Swiss, French, all the psychologists that interviewed Breitweiser and wrote reports, they all said, yeah, this guy has definitely got some problems, but all of them agreed that he truly was an aesthete, someone who loved works of art that attracted to him. Like wasn't attracted to all works of art. He liked Renaissance era, 16th and 17th century. It doesn't matter what you like. It's just, he was so passionate about art that every one of the psychologists said, yeah, truly he stole for the love of art. And as Breitweiser said to me, Mike, I'm not trying to bust through skylights and get on TV. In fact, I'm trying to be the opposite. The quieter, the least violent, the less exciting the crime, the more effective. And in some weird way, I found his quiet, like subversive crimes to be so thrilling and so literally like threading a needle. So the only thing I can say is at the very end of the book, I sort of talk about a lot of like what it was like to interview Breitweiser. And very briefly, I mentioned that we did a lot of our interviews in these tiny little European hotel rooms. And for those of your listeners who have traveled in Europe, and for those who haven't, in France especially, I mean, hotel rooms could be like the size of a walk-in closet. I could put like my hands on 2 sides, turn 90 degrees and put it, both sides. There's like a bed, maybe this tiny little desk and 1 chair. And so I'd often do these interviews in these tiny hotel rooms. 1 chair. I'm a polite man. I would let Breitweiser, the art thief, sit in the chair. I usually sat on the edge of the bed or the luggage rack. And we would be like close enough to shake hands when we were interviewing. And because Breitweiser was this, not only a great thief, he was truly an art lover and also like a self-educated. I mentioned he would make a great art professor. He knew so much about what he stole. This was like an intellectual, nonviolent, absolutely bonkers thief. So journalistic catnip. Who doesn't like that? And so whenever a Breitweiser made an obscure reference, I would open up my laptop, I would type something in, and we would look at like, oh, so this is the artist that you were talking about. And then I would close the laptop, push it to the side, and we would continue our interview. And I would let my digital recorder capture the interview. But every once in a while, I'd like lower my eyes to take a note about like, say, gestures or weird facial expressions or just impressions that came to my mind. And so I'm asking Breitweiser, like in this tiny hotel room, like, hey, man, one of the things I just can't understand is how you can steal like a work of art when there's other people around, sometimes this guard in the room, like what? You could say that and I could read it in a police report, but I just can't quite get my head around it. And we're literally like, our heads are like 2 feet from each other in this little room and I'm recording everything. So I'm trying to maintain eye contact and he stops the interview after like 30 seconds later. And he's like, did you see what I just did? And I love it when criminals sort of like start playing games like that, Brendan. And I'm like, what you just did? And I'm like looking around my room. I'm like, I'm going to figure this out. I love it. I'm not going to get outsmarted by the criminal. But I look around, I look at the desk. I'm in this tiny hotel room. It's kind of a mess because I don't really unpack my suitcase so much as turn it upside down. That's between me and you. Let's leave that.
Got it. Won't tell
me and you and your listeners. I'm not a neat. There are like hotel unpackers and not hotel unpackers. I'm not really an unpacker. I'm sort of like open the suitcase, whatever, dig through your pile, see what doesn't smell. After a while. Okay, that's the side. So I'm like, I don't see what you did, Stéphane. I really don't. And he stands up, he turns around, and at the small of his back, tucked into his waistband, is my laptop computer. I guess I had lowered my eyes for like 2 or 3 seconds to write a little note. And in that moment, Breitweiser stood up, took my laptop computer, pushed it in the small of his back and sat back down and put his hands exactly how they had been before. And by the time I look up, it seemed like he hadn't moved. And this is a funny thing I was mentioning earlier, how you could overpower people with Uzis and weapons and threats. But really the best way to outsmart someone is just to be a step ahead of them in terms of like intellectual insight. The absence of something, like if there was like suddenly a Christmas tree in my room, I would have noticed it in an instant, but my laptop, I just didn't notice the absence of it. Like your mind doesn't work that way, which actually, because he worked as a guard, I was going to tell you, like sometimes takes like an hour or two, but you're like, hey, there was something on that shelf. There was something else in that display case. It takes you, the way the human mind works is the presence of something weird. Well, you know it immediately, like right from like caveman days, like, oh, there's a threat. But the absence of something, it takes a little while for your head to sort of realize, hey, wasn't there something? Anyway, he had taken my laptop and I literally did not notice it. I feel a little embarrassed, but it's true. And at that moment, when he handed me back my laptop, I'm like, oh man, I totally understand how you were able to get away with so many crimes.
And you mentioned the psychiatrist reports. And I don't think there's an answer to this one, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because whenever you're reading good true crime, you ask this, right? You look at the perpetrator and you say, is this a nature or nurture thing? Did this person come out of the box broken, or did somebody break him along the way? And there were some things in his childhood that weren't great, but nothing catastrophic that other people haven't dealt with. Do you think that he's a case of nature versus nurture, or it's just everything together? What is it that makes him tick, that makes it so that he loves art like somebody else does, but he has to own it, almost consume it?
I mean, I really like that question because it is something I think about too. Like, what's ingrained in you and what have you learned? And I think the answer to that question in general, and I don't want to take a shortcut, but of course, the answer is a little bit of each. Let's talk about how he was born. Like, he came from a relatively wealthy family, childhood divorce, but that's not an excuse for anything that happens all the time. But he came from a relatively wealthy family. His father had this wonderful collection of oil paintings, which he ended up stealing, antique weapons, which he ended up stealing, ivory pieces, which he ended up stealing. So if you're seeing a little father issues, you're completely correct. But he grew up surrounded by these old, like 16th, 17th, 18th century, this is very European family works. Then his parents have an extremely contentious divorce. Father leaves. The father had inherited all this artwork, takes it all with him. Nothing's left behind. He breaks off all contact with his father, moves into a house, tiny little house with his mother, not the grand house that he grew up in because of divorce. And, the mother, who of us has not decorated many of our places with IKEA works? But the mother goes to IKEA, buys all this, composite shelving, and to Breitweiser, truly remember, all 5 psychologists are not, you can't fool that many, or saying this guy truly does fall in love with beautiful works of art. He did have a great eye. And that's one of the reasons why I loved working on this story. You're now living in surrounded by what to him is the ugliest and most it's like fingers on a blackboard. There's levels of sensitivity that all of us have to various and sundry things. Some of us can watch, horror movies without being affected. And one of my children has to cover their face and run out of the room. Everyone's affected by things differently. And he was truly hit by works of art so extraordinary. He had a very sensitive aesthetic soul, and I saw it in action hundreds of times, and everyone wrote about it. Despite the fact that he was a criminal and deserved to be put in jail, he truly had this sensitivity. And the breakup just slayed him inside. He was all the beauty in his life was removed. And then he found out, and this could be where we get from the nature to the nurture, he found out that he had a good skill at fooling people, at subverting expectations, at taking people's computers when it's right in front of them. And I think if he had gotten busted, his first, second, or third crime, that would have been it. But the more you get away with something, the more cocky you get. And then he meets he meets Anne-Catherine, his girlfriend, and she loved art too, not nearly in the sensitive way that Breitweiser did. And of all the things you could say about this relationship, and I actually got to see some of her psychology reports too, and talk to many people that knew them as a couple. You might think this is the most toxic, most ill-matched couple in the world, and you would be right. But also, every person I met that knew the two of them said the same thing, and that's pretty powerful, which is that they were truly in love with each other. And man, love can make you do crazy things. And so she loved him. She worked as a nurse's assistant, changing bedpans in hospitals, had tough job. And then on the weekends, they would go and steal multi-million-dollar worth of work, hang it on the wall of their bedroom and make love in a beautiful 4-poster bed. That's exciting. That's adventurous. That thrills you. And they loved each other. He loved the art. He loved his girlfriend. And so there's a lot of love going on, while at the same time, a lot of criminal behavior. And even just recounting this to you, Brendan, makes me damn, as a journalist, that's just the acupuncture that gets me all in the getting spots. Man, every part of me is I like craziness like that. You got the mother. Did the mother know? Yeah, the mother knew. The father, where is he? How do they get away with it? How can you keep avoiding the police for so long? And then what the hell happens in the end? I mean, just talking to you about it, even after 11 years of work, I'm damn, that's a good story.
Listen, I got to just poke you in a sore spot. I know it is, but I got to say it. How much does it drive you nuts? You say it in the book. You can't talk to Anne-Catherine. She will not respond to anybody. She won't talk about any of this. If somehow you got to talk to her, are you doing another book? Are you adding an addendum? Because, that's got to drive you nuts that she's part of this. She is just as much part of this as he is, but she's basically a black box to you except for the couple things that you can look at.
So, first of all, I worked on this for 11 years. I did other things to make money to feed my children, but 11 years this project took me, and I tried to leave no stone unturned. Now, Anne-Catherine Kleinklaus, the girlfriend and accomplice to Stéphane Breitweiser, has never spoken to the media, and that includes me. I was able to talk to many people that knew her, some people that spent tons of time with her. I was able to see police interrogations, so statements that she gave under oath. I was able to get transcripts of all the court trials, and even after many years of digging, home video of the two of them lounging in their like cave of, Alibaba's cave of magical wonders. So it's not quite a black hole, Anne-Catherine. I would like to have talked to her personally. Journalists can be pushy, and I definitely can be pushy, but eventually, it can say no. I sent personal letters. I, stopped by the hospital in which she works, and she was pretty forceful that she didn't want to say anything. And as you'll read in the book, she would have been in a very tough situation if she talked to me, which is either that she would have had to lie like repeatedly or expose herself to possible punishment because, I'll just say this, the police do get involved. They do get caught, and there are trials, and Breitweiser, forever in love, not just with the works of art, but with his girlfriend, does everything in his power to protect his girlfriend. So she avoids almost all punishment. I don't think it's giving too much away to say that she spends one night in prison for stealing $2 billion worth of art, many thanks to her boyfriend's willingness to fall upon his own sword. And so she knows, she's smart. She knows she got away with crimes. Talking to a journalist would not be smart. And so she's too smart to talk to a journalist. If I was able to talk to her, I have a feeling that not much would change. As I told you, as we started on the outset of this book, I triple and quadruple checked everything, double checked it with not just the source material, Breitweiser himself, court documents and police interrogations and trial transcripts, but, also the lawyers and independent fact checkers. I think that there would be one more level of depth to their relationship that I would love to add in. So Anne-Catherine, if you're listening, and I know, maybe she's surfing the internet. If you're listening and you want to get in touch with me, please send me an email through my website and I'll add it on to the soft cover version. But she's never talked to anyone. She's super smart and she's laying low. And I think if I was a fiction writer, sure, would do something different. But the fact that this is a true story makes every sentence you read, I think, have an extra bit of frisson about it. Like, this is crazy. It's also true. And so you keep that in the back of your mind. Like, this is not made up. In fact, if it was made up, you would toss the book across the room in disgust because it never happened in real life. I mean, 10 art crimes, sure. 15, all right. 20, maybe. 200, what do you expect me to believe? That can only happen in real life. So what I'm saying is, when it comes to a true story, after 11 years, you got what you got. And this is, better to have 95% of a story than none at all. But yeah, you're right. Of course, a journalist's life, you never get to 100% in anything. And eventually my wife just is like, are you going to write this thing already? Or are we going to eventually you just, I can get lost. I think every book behind me, I'm sitting in my office and I'm like, I read hundreds of books on art theory and art history. And I spent the entire pandemic doing nothing but reading every art crime book I could find in a couple of different languages. And just wanted to make sure that this one was well researched on a nice pillar of historical accuracy and also completely different than any other art crime you might read.
Personal question for you. What was your favorite crime of theirs? We'll say favorite. Obviously, it's not quite the right word, but what's your favorite?
No, I like that word. I mean, again, so I've written about violent criminals, and I think the one reason why I'm able to sort of laugh, and there are some tragedies in the end, but as you pointed out, Brendan, and I appreciate that, nobody gets physically injured. There might be some mental, some of the guards and some of the curators might have been mentally screwed up by their actions. But the fact that it was nonviolent and it was art allows you to sort of dream a little bit. Like, who doesn't go to a museum and say honey?
Well, and also something to add to that too is he never showed up with a weapon. Like, there was also never, it wasn't like, oh, he had a hammer, but he never used it. He literally never showed up with a weapon, which means even if he got caught, he was going to give himself up one way or the other.
Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned, he gets caught. You'll never guess, what happens to the collection and where it all goes and what the mother has to, everybody gets involved, really only talking about the first half of the book till the wings melt, the wax wings melt, and then crazy plummets. I mean, I just like the way Breitweiser. So when you think about art crime, or you're thinking about the movies or real life criminals, you think about this crazy amount of planning and precision, because art crime is difficult. You have to get into a museum, then you have to subvert all these security apparatus, then you have to get the piece itself, then you have to get it back out of the museum. Like, these are all very complicated steps. This isn't like a smash and grab. Breitweiser was able to spontaneously adjust or create a crime with instantaneous information. Two quick examples. One, he's at an art fair. He not only stole from museums, he stole occasionally from galleries, churches, and art shows. Really quickly, he's at an art show, heavily secured, where he already tells his girlfriend, we're just going to look at art here. And suddenly someone screams, thief, thief. And there's another thief at this art fair who's running away. He's got a bunch of security going after him. You know, like most art thieves, can't get away with even one crime. They tackle this guy, and there's this whole commotion. And Breitweiser, I think he said it to me in French, he's like, I ascended into art crime nirvana. Now, just think about this. Like, first of all, it just happened. Breitweiser had nothing to do with this other thief. It was completely coincidental. But I guess I got to use the word genius when it comes to thieving. Like, immediately thinks, oh my gosh, you know what the best time to steal is? When there's another art thief. So while all the security and everybody's head is turned and looking at the commotion, Breitweiser steals a multi-million-dollar oil painting and doesn't even hide it, just like strolls out the door because all security abandoned their post. And that's possibly the simplest, but like, wow, the chutzpah, the cold blood, just the ability to reformulate a plan in an instant's notice. If I sound kind of impressed, I mean, I don't really recommend stealing, but boy, that's pretty impressive. And another one was similar, where he comes across, he's in a museum, a huge museum, and he sees this display box, which he was able to break into display boxes. And this one looks like it's already, like a thief has already come by. There's a bunch of missing spots. And Breitweiser always had a theory that if you rearrange the stuff you don't steal in a box, the casual guard will not notice something missing for several turns of his or her, patrol. That gives you enough time to get out of a museum. He sees like all these blank spots in a display box, thinking, man, a thief has already been here again and didn't rearrange the box. And then he looks in there, and there's an index card, just an index card, folded in half, put in this box. And all it says on the index card is objects removed for study. That's it. Folded in half index card. And Breitweiser has this great idea. He actually doesn't like the art that's in this box with the card, but he steals the card, goes to a room in the Renaissance wing where it's filled with these amazing silver goblets and centerpieces. I'm talking Renaissance era solid silver, like the most ornate, and just whatever you're imagining in your mind, triple it in terms of just brilliance. And he basically steals like all 11 pieces out of this display case and just puts this bent index card in the middle saying, objects removed for study. It's 3 different visits it takes him to steal the 11 pieces. And nobody thinks like, oh yeah, objects must have been removed for study. There's somebody down in the basement studying it. And he steals millions of dollars worth of silver. And as Breitweiser tells me in French, Mike, I think the most effective art stealing tool that I've ever come across in my career is a folded in half index card. And so it's that simplicity that I admire, sure, don't condone, but as a journalist who collects crazy stories, just like a beautiful work of art fires up Breitweiser's sensory system, a great crime story gets me going like that. So, and that's a great crime story.
Listen, my final question, Mike, is always, that there are people who don't like nonfiction, right? That it's boring. It's, history is a class I took in high school. I can't imagine after hearing all of this that people would still be doubtful about whether or not they should read this book. But if somebody's like, I'm not into nonfiction, and I sat them in front of you and they said, Mike, why should I read The Art Thief? What would you say?
First thing I would say is I totally understand about not liking nonfiction. Man, I read a lot of books, research and pleasure. And there's sometimes this tone, author at the lectern, I call it. It's like, it's funny. I wasn't the greatest student in school. I love learning. I love reading, but having someone lecture me and droning on is really boring. And so that person who says they don't like nonfiction isn't wrong. There's a lot of that weird professor at the lectern stuff. Don't dismiss an entire genre because you've had a bad example. The only thing I would say is, I wouldn't say steal my book, but if you see The Art Thief at a bookstore, first of all, it's 205 pages. That is thin. I'm not talking a 700-page doorstop. I'm talking one flight, LA to New York, have a drink, have a meal, and you could finish the book and leave it in the pocket in front of you. All I would say is this. I mean, online on my website, at a bookstore, read the first sentence. If it interests you, read the second. If it interests you, read the third. If you find yourself caught up and you're on the fifth or sixth paragraph, keep on going. If you get bored, you stop. In fact, I'm just going to tell you on your show, I'm going to make an offer. Anybody who is interested in what I've said today and does do me the honor of picking up the book. And by the way, this is kind of how I make my living, selling books. What a ridiculous way to make a living. If you buy the book and you're bored, you write me a note through my website, MikeFinkel@me.com, and I'll refund you my commission on that book. I can't give you the whole price back, but I'll give you my cut back because that's how much I believe that you will never guess the ending. If you write me and say, Mike, I saw that ending coming a mile away, I'll be like, first of all, I'll be like, you're trying to get $2 out of me? Like, but if you truly guess the ending and you write me a note, I'll refund you my cut. If you say, Mike, I was bored by that story, I'll refund it to you. I mean, that's all I can say. Give it a try. It's short. It's snappy. I think I mentioned earlier in our talk that I do think about readers when I'm writing. You're the one who talks to the writers. Writers make me nervous. Most of my friends are photographers or other professions, waiters and mechanics, writers, too competitive. I think about the readers. I don't want anyone to be bored. Textbooks are for classrooms. I really think a good piece of nonfiction elevates it above fiction. There's some elements that you can't use, but keep holding your mind that this actually happened. And it should add a whole nother level of insanity to this story. That's all I could say.
Mike, I wasn't bored for a single second. Listeners, don't email me because I'm not sending you any money, but you can email Mike. Listen, thank you so much. This was a great time. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Brandon.
And that's it for this episode. Michael, thank you so much for coming on The Art Thief. This book is great for everybody. You don't even need to be a history nerd or a true crime nerd. It's interesting. It's pretty short. If you don't want, a 500-page book, it's perfect for everybody. Please go out and get it. In the meantime, hit us up on all the socials we talked about before and keep an ear out for our next episode this week as a little present to you. Till next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.